Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to conduct a meticulous, forensic breakdown of the Arctic's absolute worst maritime disaster. It's like a giant, tragic puzzle. We're going to piece together the timeline, the extreme environment, the 19th century technology, and even the biology, all to answer one massive question. Why did a seemingly invincible, state-of-the-art mission fail so catastrophically?
Okay, let's dive into this, because Sir John Franklin's doomed quest for the Northwest Passage is one of those stories that just haunts you, right? Back in 1845, you've got 129 men, plus two absolute marvels of Victorian naval engineering, sailing off into the Arctic. They were hunting for that legendary sea route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And then, they just vanished. Boof! How on earth does an expedition packed with literally the best technology the 19th century had to offer just disappear from the face of the Earth? Well, let's find out.
Section 1. The Ultimate Arctic Mystery.
To really grasp the sheer scale of this failure, we have to understand the incredible ambition of the mission. I mean, this wasn't just a casual mapping trip. It was a highly calculated, massively funded push to secure a hugely lucrative trade route to Asia. To put this into perspective, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were effectively the space shuttles of their era. Originally, these were three-masted bomb vessels, built specifically for coastal bombardment. That means their hulls were exceptionally thick to withstand the massive recoil of firing 3-ton mortars. So the Royal Navy took these floating fortresses, heavily modified them for polar ice, added cutting-edge steam-powered heating systems, and packed them with enough tinned food to last 3 to 5 years without resupply. They were practically invincible, right? Except they were sailing into a harsh, unknown environment that literally couldn't care less about Victorian engineering.
Try to imagine the sheer cultural shock when they didn't come back. The British public and the Admiralty were utterly stunned. Comparing it to the Challenger disaster really hits the nail on the head. How could the absolute best of the best just vanish? This collective disbelief actually launched 38 different search expeditions in the second half of the 19th century. It snowballed into the largest rescue effort in human history, driven by this almost desperate need to figure out what went wrong.
Section 2. Trapped in the ice. So, before any machinery or human bodies broke down, the geography itself laid a massive trap. The ships unknowingly sailed straight into a region called Larsen Sound, up north of King William Island. Climatologists refer to this specific area as an ice sink. Basically, sea ice from the northwest and northeast gets violently pushed southward directly into the sound, creating a colossal, impenetrable wall of ice. And to make matters worse, the mid-19th century was a particularly brutal cold period. That multi-year ice trapped in the sound likely didn't thaw for over 5 years. No amount of reinforced oak or fancy steam heating was going to bust them out of that localized climate trap.
Locked in this crushing, groaning Arctic ice, the crews were stuck, just drifting helplessly for a very, very long time. But, and this is a really crucial point, based on research by experts like William Battersby, these men were highly experienced Arctic seamen. They were hand-picked. So when the ice closed in, they didn't just immediately lose their minds and panic. They actually maintained their strict naval structure. They lived in their designated social groups or messes and just dug in to survive the harsh winters as best they could.
But then, we look at the timeline and it is incredibly grim. We actually only know these dates because of a single solitary sheet of paper, the famous Victory Point letter, which was found buried under a stone cairn in 1859. So, they departed England in May 1845. By September 1846, they were completely locked in the ice. The letter bluntly states that Sir John Franklin himself died on June 11, 1847. By April 22, 1848, with 24 men already dead, the survivors finally gave up on the ships and abandoned them.
Section 3. Poisoned by their provisions.
Now, you might be wondering, why did so many men die before they even left the safety of the ships? Well, this is where the story takes on a deeply tragic irony. The very things meant to keep them alive became their invisible killers. Those thousands of tinned foods we talked about, which were state-of-the-art tech at the time, were unfortunately sealed with lead soldering. That lead was silently leaching into their food supply. Combine that systemic lead poisoning with outbreaks of tuberculosis and scurvy, and you've got a crew being ravaged by disease from the inside out, all while trapped in total cold and darkness.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how we actually proved it. Fast forward to the 1980s. Anthropologist Owen Beatty led a forensic team to Beechey Island, where the expedition spent its first winter. They exhumed the graves of 3 crewmen, John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain. And because of the deep Arctic permafrost, their bodies were startlingly perfectly preserved.
Autopsies proved conclusively that tuberculosis, scurvy, and absolutely massive lead levels, which directly matched the lead solder from a nearby pile of discarded food tins, were massive factors in their deaths.
Section 4. Starvation and desperate measures.
Weak, sick, and finally realizing the ice was never, ever going to release their ships, the remaining crew made a fateful decision. 105. That's the exact number of desperate survivors who walked away from the Erebus in terror on April 22, 1848. They made landfall at Victory Point on King William Island, and they began a doomed march south toward the Fish River. Their wild hope was to eventually reach a Hudson's Bay Company trading post, which was roughly 500 kilometers away.
And they weren't just walking either. They were physically hauling incredibly heavy ship's boats across jagged, unforgiving sea ice. But again, they weren't irrational madmen. Archaeological evidence shows they actually carefully modified these boats for river travel. They added 9-inch weather cloths and fitted iron stanchions as oarlocks, which searchers later dug up. They knew exactly where they were, and they knew exactly where they needed to go. The tragedy is they were just too sick, and the distance was simply too vast.
The end of this march was truly horrific. Over the past few decades, scientists have recovered nearly 400 human bones and bone fragments scattered along their route, and modern skeletal forensics have found unmistakable cut marks on many of these bones. It's a grim discovery, but it completely validates the reports from the local Inuit, who had told early searchers they had seen starving men resorting to cannibalism in their final desperate hours. Section 5. The evidence left behind.
So how did we finally put all this together? Well, in 1854, a Hudson's Bay Company surgeon named John Ray, who was a guy that deeply respected indigenous survival skills, spoke Inuit languages, and even wore snowshoes of his own design, sat down and actually listened to the Inuit. They told him the agonizing truth about the starving white men and the cannibalism. But when Ray reported this back to England, Victorian society lost its mind. They furiously rejected it. The famous author Charles Dickens wrote the scathing quote we're looking at here, outright refusing to believe Royal Navy sailors could do such a thing. Dickens offensively suggested the Inuit themselves had murdered the men. John Ray was completely right, but his reputation was totally destroyed just for telling the truth. And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute power and accuracy of that indigenous knowledge. Take American explorer Charles Francis Hall. He spent years in the 1860s actually living with the Inuit, trading for these meticulously cataloged relics, things like silver spoons, brass tubes, and uniform buttons. The Inuit were the first to find the physical evidence of the disaster. They scavenged these items, integrated them into their own tools, and most importantly, preserved the oral history of exactly where they found them.
Because it turns out the Inuit transmission of history is astonishingly perfect. For over 160 years, the exact locations of the sunken ships remained this massive mystery to Western searchers. But by finally setting aside their hubris, listening to, and being guided by that flawless oral history, which detailed exactly where the large boats had been seen sinking, Parks Canada archaeologists made an incredible breakthrough. They located HMS Erebus in 2014 and HMS Terror in 2016, sitting in the icy waters exactly where the stories always said they would be.
So, what does this all mean? The major takeaway here is that the Franklin expedition didn't just fail because of a streak of bad luck. It was a fatal cascade. It was an unavoidable geographical trap compounded by biological poisoning and the sheer overwhelming force of an environment that Victorian technology simply couldn't conquer. It is a stark, absolute reminder of the fatal intersection of human hubris and the unforgiving power of nature. Which leaves us with a pretty haunting question to end on. If the absolute best technology of the 19th century was so easily swallowed up by the ice, what other secrets, what other forgotten ambitions are still out there, frozen in time?